to take some time to start by introducing the South Asia Working Group, what we do here at Stanford. And for that, I would like my fellow co-coordinator, Shubhangni Gupta, to do the honors.
Thank you so much, Paris. I'm sorry for just starting the recording in the middle of your introduction. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and joining us for this session from all over the world. I think I'll just take a minute of our time before we get on to our absolutely relevant and exciting talk for today with Kartik Maini, who Paris will be introducing very, very soon. So the Stanford South Asia Working Group was started in early 2021 as a platform for students, early researchers, postdocs, and just early career academics to have a safe space and a community platform to be able to share and discuss their ideas at different stages and points of their thinking. So things you wanted, one wants to discuss, papers you're working on, just also topics relevant to our time. We started in the heyday of COVID in many ways. So it was also a platform that was envisioned to provide a space where students could also discuss their vulnerabilities, anxieties, and ways forward in this context. Since then, it has developed to just different kinds of activities through which we invite speakers from all over the world, we're very proud to say, to communicate via paper presentations, through movie discussions, general group discussions, panels, and moderated discussions as well. So we hope to continue this good work, and I'm very, very proud to have with us Kartik Maini from the University of Chicago with us today. Paris will be introducing them just in a moment. I would also just, before we proceed, like to thank our co-organizers, the Stanford Center for South Asia, whose support has been absolutely constant and very supportive, and without whom this event would not have been possible today, without whom this platform would not have been possible today. So thank you very much. And Paris, on to you.
Thank you so much, Shubhangini. It's really an honor for me to introduce Kartik Maini, who is a PhD student and researcher at the Department of South Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. Kartik Maini's doctoral project is situated at the intersections of religious studies, intellectual history, and critical philology, and in a multilingual archive composing of Sanskrit, Hindi, Marathi, and Tamil sources. They are interested in historicizing the discourses of asceticism in South Asia with an eye towards tracing their emergent worldliness in early colonial modernity. Many grew up in Delhi, India, and took their BA and MA degrees in history from the University of Delhi. And we are so proud to have them with us today. And without further ado, I think Kartik will now start sharing their slide and move on to the talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Paris. Let me try and share my screen now. I am the host still, right? I'm one of the hosts, right, on the Zoom. Let's see. Visible?
Yes.
1 second. Sorry. I can't seem to close the chat box.
What are you not able to close?
The chat box. 1 second, sorry. Yes, perfect. Okay. Thank you, Paris, and thank you, Shubhangini, for having me here. It is great to be speaking for or to the SAWG. Thanks also for, I'd say, for fronting the problem of method this year. And I hope that the rest of us in South Asia, those of us who work on South Asia, catch up and catch on sooner rather than later. I know that the South Asia Forum here swears, as it were, by fieldwork. And so this is not going to be a ploy to convert any of you. In fact, over the years, and thanks in large measure to Paris, it is I who have been converted, or rather convinced that our worlds can and must meet. So today I'm going to defy the picket line of my discipline and make the case that textual work is also a kind of field work. This is because accessing texts that make up the bread and butter of much South Asia scholarship, whether we recognize it or not, and in most cases we do not, involves navigating a field, of a field being a complex maze of relations, featuring humans, non-humans, governmental or non-governmental actors, all of whom make certain claims upon us, claims we often cannot refuse. I want to spend the first half of my talk doing this, though it carries over into the second. And in the second, what I do not want this to be about is my own work, but let me still mention it in a line or two. I'm a scholar of early modern and modern South Asia. I work on sannyasis or renouncers, practices or cultures of the self vis-a-vis the world, and with manuscripts in Sanskrit, Hindi, Marathi, Tamil, and so on. Then in the second half of my talk, I want to give you a flavor of pre-modern textual cultures and how sharply they differ from our notions of what a book is or what a modern archive is, and what both of them are capable of doing and what manuscripts themselves are capable of doing. The manuscript opens a rich, very rich textual world for us, and we often miss it. So without further ado, let me move on to part one. I have about half an hour, and I hope to finish on it. So I want to begin by noting that, noting how offbeat my archival locations are, I'm going to be talking about two sites. The first is the Nagari Pracharini Sabha, NPS in Banaras, Varanasi, UP, Uttar Pradesh, and the Samarth Vagdev Devta Mandir in Dhude, which is in Maharashtra. It's actually in Khandesh, but in that very state. Both of these are in India, and I call them offbeat, not just because they are not the British Library or the National Archives of India, but because a lot of what I had read about the archive, all my Anne Stoller, Foucault, Derrida, Guha, and so on, did not seem to fit as neatly here as I was hoping they would. These archives turned out to be about a lot more than power and subversion. And even if the government had played some part in their formation, and it is honestly very slim in both places since they're both run privately, and thus like the most palpable thing in both sides, especially as we will see the NPS, the Pracharini Sabha, was the shadow of absolute neglect. I don't sort of want to recap the scholarship mentioned above, which is really present in most syllabi and so forth, except to draw upon Bembe, who in a similar vein forces us to confront the bare materiality of the archive. The archive, he says, cannot have any power without a material architectural dimension. The building, which in which it like a shrub grows, and the building that it colonizes. And in so having, the archive can either be, Bembe says, it can be a temple, which involves a variety of rituals, or it can be a cemetery that presents the dead to the living. I find that cemetery bit very telling, and I want to slightly revise that by adding that insofar as the archive is presented by its custodians to those conducting research, that is to the living by the mediation of the living, it is never truly dead. And in navigating this maze, for me, the archive comes alive. The archive is also what I would call a sensorium, and this includes each thing from the bare touch of a bare document to the layers of dust on its coverings. All of these things need thorough sensory navigation. And finally, the archive is lodged in social processes that go beyond the records it houses. And this is more anecdotal. So in both the NPS and the Samarth Vag Devta Mandir, I, being very clearly South Asian, was asked my caste by way of asking me my last name. Also in both, I had to make a conscious effort, a conscious bid to present or dress as male, which I, as a gender non-conforming person, usually do not. So like no feminine clothing, no jewelry and such like. Above all, as Farsh observes in her book, The Lure of the Archive is marked or marred by circumstances that you cannot foresee. This is by design, because we later write essays, papers, books about the things we discover, but when we do find them in the archive, we often don't know what to do with them. The archive is a field because it too compels you to make friends with the unknown. And you do this all by yourself, because another feature of dwelling in the archive, as Farsh tells us, is the dark, haunting solitude of the researcher, facing records to be made sense of, relations to be forged, places to be made familiar. So let's begin with the Nagari Pracharini Sabha, the NPS, which is also the first institution that I will be focusing on. Founded in 1893 in Queen's College, Banaras, the NPS was a forerunner in mobilizing the cause of the Nagari Lipi or script and of the Hindi language in general. This was done against other scripts like Kethi, and more importantly, against other languages like Urdu. It was couched in terms of making Hindi written in Nagari both popular and pure, cleansed of its associations with Urdu and Persian and so on. This, of course, has a key religious or communal dimension to it. And the NPS was a historical linchpin in the sort of forceful coupling of Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan and modern South Asia. The NPS carried out research in manuscripts, it gave out prizes, it entered textbooks, it published journals, it put together meetings of artists and poets called sammelans, and slowly gathered a very considerable membership composed of very rich patrons like Madan Mohan Malaviya. It was, and to a large extent continues to be, financed by donations, though I know that the Pracharini Sabha Trust has in recent years sort of tried to seek help from other places and other sources and so on. Richard King, in his book One Language, Two Scripts, shows us that most of the NPS's members came from northern India, not to mention from castes higher up in the rank. There were also very few South Indians and practically no Muslims at all. Saying that, I now want to speed us into the present. Let's see. So this is again sort of auto-ethnographic. This is the Arya Bhasha Pustakalaya, which is the library where the archive is contained. And that is my membership slip from there. The membership, as you can see, costs all of $100, which is very nominal for any archive in the world. So as I said, I'm going to speed us into the present. So the first thing you notice when you enter the NPS, and the next slide shows that, is that it is now only partly a place for archival research. It is also a place for reading and casual chit-chat, although this don't really seem to be chatting here, but still, for school and college undergraduate students who, as you can see, occupy most of the seats, chairs, which is fair since it is indeed a library. The second bit you notice, and it is often the first for most people actually, is the ruin and the decay. The building of the Sabha and of the library is falling apart in various ways. Next, the texts or records in it are also rotting away, eaten by moths and insects from the edges, or even the center, and coated, as you can see, in layers and layers of dust. The catalog does not often match up to the actual location of the record, and in many cases, the documents that I asked for could not be found. I I want to sort of sit with this picture and really the realness of dust for a bit. And here I also want to thank Bhavya, who made the flyer for this talk, for making me think about the non-human, and in this case, the non-sentient, by drawing a tiger in the flyer of the poster. Because it is in the archive that we interact with various kinds of, for want of a better word, humans, but we also face humans and sort of other natural forces that do not easily bend to our human conceit. The historian a friend once said to me is a rodent. I also once remember paging a document in the National Archives of India. My request was sent back to me because it could not be fulfilled, and it couldn't be fulfilled because the reason went, the cat peed on the record. Many documents, similarly, both in the NPS and beyond, can't be furnished because they have been eaten up by moths and insects. And here in the NPS, it is, of course, dust. And dust is a fertile ground from which to introduce Caroline Steedman's Dust, the Archive and Cultural History. And this is a quotation that really spoke to me. In her landmark book, she makes the case that archive fever, which is a phrase that we often get from Derrida, can often mean a real fever caused by dust and other airborne particles in the archive. And she writes here, we are forced to consider whether it was not life that he breathed into the souls who were smothered now in the past, but death that he took into himself with each lungful of dust. Years ago, my teacher in the University of Delhi, and these are things that most from US universities don't notice for some reason, told me that most people who work in the archives, like the people who bring us our records, die of lung or other sorts of respiratory issues. The people with whom I was working at the NPS were coughing and coughing all the time. So it is really they who take death into themselves, in so far as they make our work, our research possible. And the last thing that I want to say about the NPS is also about them. The NPS is actually very ill-famed because of the bribes or rishwat or chai pani, as they call it, that you have to give to get the managers or the managers of the archive to get you what you need to see. People complain about it all the time, and for good reason. But consider also the fact that their salaries have actually been frozen since the 1990s. They essentially make their living off a few extra bucks that they get from researchers from the US or also from JNU and so on. So the tale of the NPS, which I have tried to tell very briefly, is also a tale of their poverty, their desperation, and the life that I supposedly breathe into old documents cannot be sort of extricated from their breathing bodies, and the harm that our work causes them, even as it sustains them. The next site that figures in my work, and the next one that I want to talk about, is the Samarth Vag Devta Mandir. This is also a private collection, but it is much better managed and very fascinating. The Samarth Vag Devta Mandir, as you can read in the signboard. Vag Devta means God, goddess of speech, but it also just means well-spoken. And of course, I'm sure most of us know what mandir means, which is a temple. The Vag Devta Mandir is an archive of manuscripts and records belonging to or surrounding the life and labors of Samarth Ramdas, who was a sannyasi from the 17th century, and he was based by and large in Maharashtra, but he moved a lot. And this mandir is located in Dhude, which is in Khandesh, as I mentioned. Ramdas is typically known for his ties to the Maratha king Shivaji, which became very pregnant, very controversial in the modern period because Ramdas was Brahmin and Shivaji was not. The mandir, set up in 1935, owes its formation to really one man whose name was Shankar Rao Dio, a congressman, also called the Tilak of Khandesh, who was devoted to Ramdas and who set up the Sabha also in 1935, of which the mandir is a part. Dio also sort of made a lot of discoveries related to Ramdas. So he discovered the cave in which Ramdas is said to have composed his magnum opus, the Dasboth, and sourced thousands of manuscripts from various Ramdasis mathas in Western and Central South Asia or India. It is a very precious resource with manuscripts in Marathi, and in Marathi it has things which are both in the Badabodha and the Modi script, Sanskrit, Persian, Kannada, and so forth. The Sabha and the Mandir are also like the NPS, sustained by donations, but these are from devotees of Ramdas. These are the same people who want the records of the Sant preserved, read, and cherished. So the next slide should give you a good sense of what the archive or the mandir looks like. The archive or the mandir, as the name suggests, is a devotional space with, as you can see, a murti of Ramdas at the center, and devotional music sort of serving as the sonic backdrop as you work in the archive. And this of course takes us back to Bembe, who made this point about the archive being a kind of temple. And here, as you can see, the archive is quite literally a temple. Shoes have to be left outside and hands thoroughly washed before you can consult the records there. And again, I want to slip into an anecdote about my time there. Towards the end of my time there this summer, the chief manager of the archive took me aside and showed me folios in Ramdas's own hand, as also paintings of epic scenes which were sketched by him, by Ramdas. This will be in the next slide. These are the illustrations, and this is the folio which is in Ramdas's own hands. And if you can see my cursor, then you can see that it has a clear chap of having been written by Ramdas. Ramdas Dasena Likhitam Idam Pustakam. It is in Sanskrit, which is very telling, and I'll get back to why that's key. But the anecdote. So seeing these folios, he told me, was a privilege that I had earned by spending time at the mandir, and this tactile contact with the saint was a reward for my work in the archive, a reward that I had shown myself capable and worthy of receiving by my work, and also, I presume, by speaking in Marathi with him. This space of the archive is contrary to how we often view the archive. It is decidedly not a place where religion doesn't enter, and it is devotion that really sustains this archive. And towards the end of my time at this archive, I was very struck by the contrast between the NPS and the Mandir archive. The NPS is sort of marred by a resignation of neglect, of decay, and so on, while the mandir had a clear thirst for recognition. So I hope I have been able to convey the sort of delicate social navigation that is involved in dwelling in the archive. And of course, this is much like field work, because once you find your sources in one place, which is what I did, you have to keep going back to sustain those bonds, much like the field in field work. So to go back to Farsh, in the end, it turns out that the researcher is not alone after all. I I think that the solitude that Farge made a case of is overstated. It's overdone. So this gives me a fillip into the second part of my talk, which is going to be about where I sort of want to give you a sense of the textual ground that we stand on as scholars of pre-modern South Asia. This is, I have to mention, a world before print, before what we know as the book, mass-produced, completely free from error, meant to be consumed on a mass scale by private readers who may be far from each other, but are all reading the very same thing. All of these are suppositions that we have to leave when we enter the world, when we enter this world. And this, but I do want to talk about print for a bit, because print is best, let's say, captured by the Gutenberg moment, when Gutenberg, who was a gem cutter, cut up the English alphabet in a usable type and printed the Bible in 40. So these are 42-line pages, as you can see. Print, and this, I think, was sometime in 1455, so very early. Print, however, came to South Asia much later, which in pre-modern South Asia leaves us with the world of the manuscript, each unique, each fashioned by the labor of the hand. Here, I also want to mention that the switch from manuscript to print was not a sudden jolt, and I think this is key to remember, because there is a certain way in which we tell the history of this transition from these cultures, these textual cultures, to the world of print. And in fact, the earliest modern printed books in India, such as those printed by the Ganesh Press in Banaras, this is slide 11, in the 19th century, were actually designed like manuscripts. And that's, I think, very telling. That said, manuscript itself is not a monolithic word. The earliest types, of course, were the palm leaf ones. And this is the next slide, the palm leaf ones, the earliest sort of that we have from South Asia, and also from, I'd say, from elsewhere. And notice here, if you can again see my cursor, the holes made in the center for the thread to go through. And this is also going to come up later, but if you read any Sanskrit, you will know these sorts of palm leaf texts very, very well. Then sometime in the Sultanate period, paper came to South Asia and became wildly popular, replacing parchment. For lack of time, I now want to sort of quickly take you to the early modern period, which is the 16th to 18th centuries, and to the kind of Hindi and Marathi texts that I work with. And let's here as well extend our concern with the material being of the archive to the material being of the manuscript. Because, as I'm going to make the case, the material form of the text is often our biggest cue to the social function it served in its context. And here I want to show you three types of manuscripts. This by no measure does this exhaust their diversity, but this should, I hope, serve to give you a sort of synoptic view of what I have in mind. I want to, as I said, show you three types. So let's move on to the first one. Yeah. So the first type is this one, and it's called the kitab, which is Arabic for, I mean, not book, but text. And this belongs to the Sultanate's period by and large, and the form of the earliest Hindi sources, though written in the Persian script, were actually Sufi romances, and this is also one. This is one of the earliest texts that we have in the language. These kitab texts were bound, so we can call them codex, and they were bound with leather or wood. They usually have a lot of paintings, which is also what you can see in this folio. And most Persian-based texts took this form. Most Persian-based genres took this form of the text, which is the kitab form. Then I want to move on to what is my most beloved form, which is pothi, which pothi comes from the Sanskrit word pustak. And I love these because the pothi was the form that scholarly texts took. The folios of these sort of manuscripts, the pothis, were not bound, but just tied together with a cloth, typically a red cloth. And again, if you follow the cursor, you can see that the cloth is right here. And also in the next one, the cloth is right here. So these are not bound. These are tied up in a cloth, which is called basta, or which is Farsi for closed. And so slide 14, which is from the Samarth Vagdevta Mandir. This is a very well-maintained laminated pothi, which is not like most pothis that you will find, but it's very well preserved. Then the next one is from the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute. And here I want to draw attention, as I said while we were discussing palm leaf texts, that there were holes in the center. So this is, of course, in paper, but you'll see that these spaces which the scribe has left out, they make not just for a very good design, but they also continue the palm leaf style by leaving space for a thread to go through the center. And all of these, like all the holes that you can make in these spaces are key, is what I'm saying. And the text in pothis would typically be in black ink, and the paratext. And by paratext, I mean quotations, verse numbers, the titles, section headings, and so on. They would typically be in red ink or powder. This is called hingul in Hindi and hingur in Marathi. Then we can move on to the third type, which is fascinating, but about which I'm not going to have a lot of time to speak. This type is known as the Gutaka in Hindi and the Bard in Marathi. Gutaka comes from the Sanskrit Gutika, which means ball. These were notebooks. These were private notebooks. And that means that these were not public facing like the kitab and the pothi, but used by bards, bards in kirtans and other oral genres as aids to remember things, to remember verses, and to remember the script of what they were going to perform. These two were bound like kitabs, whereas you can clearly see they are bound vertically, and also they are bound with cloth and cardboard, but also, as you can see, in a very messy way, because these are really not texts that are made to be read by anyone but the bard, by the person who is putting life into the text. And these folios kind of fold on top of each other when you put them together, which gives these texts a rounded look. And that's why in Hindi it's called Gutaka, which comes from the Sanskrit Gutika, ball. And it's hard to see, I think, why it seems to be round when you actually feel the text. And for this, you have to hold a bard in your hands, which is why I'm so concerned with the material form of the text. So there's a lot to say about text, but in this sort of last part of the presentation, I want to focus on two things in particular. And with those two things, I'm going to end. First, the Gutaka or the bard is really a manual for performance. So writing in this world is bound up with the oral, the sonic, the oral, and so on. So to our picture of the solitary author, we have to add the figure of the bard, the person who performs the text and who begins her task after a text is composed. And also, I think it's key to remember that the text itself is in flux, because it's being remade with every notebook that's written, every folio, every new scribe that takes the task of committing the text to paper. Also, the pothis, which I've talked about, led very public lives. They also were performed, and they were particularly used to teach in various contexts, but definitely the context of the matha or the monastery. The second thing that I want to talk about is the paratext, which, as I mentioned, reveals a lot about the text itself. And even in the paratext, what I really want to talk about is the colophon. The colophon, the colophon gives you information about the author, the scribe, who is the next figure that I want to add. So author, bard, scribe. The scribe, the location of the scribe's scribal work, the date, and so forth. So this slide, which is from Rory, is a manuscript of the Ramcharitmanas, as you can again follow the cursor, Ramcharitmanas. And this also gives you, so it gives you the entire, it gives you the year, which is 1759 by Samvat, which for us is going to be 1704. It tells you, it gives you various names. As you can, again, just follow the cursor. Har Das ji, jinke Shishya Swami, Khema Chandra, and so on. So like it gives you a detailed line of succession through whose mouths and through whose hands the teaching has passed. So I'll read a translation of the colophon by Tyler Williams, whose article this is taken from. The colophon reads, Saturday, the second day of the dark half of the month of Falgun, 1759, 5th of March, 1705. Copied by Gangaram, disciple of Swami Lakshmi Das, disciple of Swami Khem Das, disciple of Narhar Das, disciple of the great fully realized Dayalji or Haridas, in the city of Didwana. The location is key. Here's where the city is mentioned, Didwana, which is in Rajasthan. For reading by Bhudar Das. Obeisance to the great Supreme Soul. Obeisance to the great beloved of the daughter of Janaka, Rama. And then that sort of ends with this this incantation, Ram, 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 Ram. The colophon, as I want to suggest, and also you should notice that there's a red pigment which the colophon is marked by, and this is key because some sort of powder or pigment is going to be used in various contexts to tell the colophon apart from the rest of the text to mark the paratext. So the colophon, as I want to say, is always exploding with meaning. For the kitab, which is the genre that we explore here, although this doesn't have the colophon, it shows us how these texts changed hands and the sort of the immense commercial and social worth that these texts came to hold. And for pothis, which are the kinds of texts that we considered here, which passed between gurus and disciples, as we see in this folio very clearly, the colophon serves a key purpose. And this purpose is to say that the person who is reading or listening to this pothi, it conveys the message that this is a source that you can trust, because only knowledge coming from qualified teachers can be trusted. And this is also often why the colophon is in Sanskrit, which was the case in the Ramdas manuscript that we saw. Ramdasena Likhitam idam pustakam. When the scribe is a shishya or a disciple writing their guru's words down into pothis, it signals a sort of contract, but maybe that's not the word I'm looking for. It signals a sort of kinship of spirit between the guru and the disciple, and the guru teaches while the shishya commits those words to paper forever. Let's end with the example of Ramdas, who is the figure that I've been taken by for a long time now. Ramdas's main and beloved scribe was his own Shishya, Kalyan Swami. Ram Das really oversaw how his words were written down, and he was very precise about these things, not just about what was being written, but also how it was being written. And this is brought out very clearly and beautifully in his magnum opus, the Daspods, which has a section called Lekhan Kriya Nirupan, or a description of the act of writing. And this is the bit I have decided to sort of quote here, but it's a large essay. And he says, in one's writing, a reader should be able to find anything except errors, for a writer must not seem careless. Young writers ought to be specially careful. Write in such a way as to draw your readers. Fine, intricate letters written in one's youth are of no use to old, deteriorating eyes. Therefore, forge a balance and use letters that are neither too small nor too large. Leaving adequate margins, write in clear, bold letters. And in so doing, your writing will stand the test of time, even if its surface paper decays. Write with such care as to stoke the jealousy of others. Make them wonder, who is this man who writes so wonderfully? And what sort of a man must he be? Of course, as it goes without saying, his scribe made a lot of errors, as all of us do. So thanks to the work of Shankar Rao Dio, which you will now see in what is going to be the last slide, we know that Ramdas sat with the pothi after his scribe was done writing it, and he sort of checked it for corrections. So this is Dio's handwriting, but the words in red ink tell you what Ramdas's corrections were. So here, for instance, he makes a correction in Yethanu, and the correction he makes is spasht nu ahe. So he asks the scribe to make the nu clearer. And I think with this, I can sort of conclude, which is that despite the best efforts of gurus like Ramdas, these manuscripts did and indeed do have lots of errors, and this is one thing that separates them from the relative perfection of print. But if these texts are a record of human failing, then they teach us that there is beauty in failure. I want to end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kartik, for that incredibly rich talk. May I request you to stop sharing your screen and
Sure.
then
Sorry.
do the Q&A. Thank you. That was quite remarkable, extraordinary feat to actually traverse so many centuries and so many locations and so many materialities, which I think is a key takeaway from your talk. And we really, really cherish the fact that you respected our fieldwork bias by first of all agreeing to come and talk to us, and also by taking fieldwork back to textual research. I have a lot of questions, but I'm not going to take any privilege of moderation and actually first move towards the audience to pose their questions to Kartik. We have almost 15 minutes of Q&A. Shubhangni, would you like to go ahead first?
Yes, sorry, just invoking the co-coordinator card here, and just to also maybe give the audience a little bit of time to think through their questions. Audience members, you can also put in your questions in the chat. If you'd like them to be anonymous, you can send them directly to either Paris or myself, or just put them in or raise your hand and we'll recognize them. Okay, so Kartik, thank you so much for such a lovely talk. And as a former history student myself, who's worked in the archives for quite a bit of time, almost 4 years, I appreciate and really resonate with a lot of things you've said. And I think what I was really taken with was also the diversity of the archives that you've looked at, like the different kinds, to be able to draw the comparatives and the observations that you have. My question was related to just since we're looking at the field working aspect of the archive, is something that I was I grapple with every time I enter a new archive is that every archive has its own cataloging system, its own indexing system. And what always takes me aback is that the facade or the illusion when a researcher steps into an archive is that you have to enter that system, and that system is absolutely well structured and systematized to work in the researcher's favor. But a lot of initial time, especially if you're working with limited time, goes into understanding that particular archive's curious way of arranging things, which may have no homogeneous or uniform standard, which may also not address the absences or the missing documentation that you may be looking at. You'd spoken about the National Archives, where I've worked for a little while as well, and they have a very extensive index, but that index does not show what they have and what they don't, just the fact that these are possibilities you can call upon. And other archives, have other systems. So anyway, my question here is more to do with how would you place the fieldwork aspect really of this, the different navigations, especially the initial navigations of these diverse archives. And who do you think, is really the agentic factor here? Like the researcher who's stepping into these archives, thinking that, okay, they will get the material that they want, versus the people who assure you that the system in this archive is exactly the way it's supposed to be, and you're the one who has to learn how to access it, or the archive by itself, that every archive cannot be arranged in a similar fashion, even if it's all the archives that one's dealing with are government documents or person letters or different kinds. And there is something within the documents within the archive that require the differentiations that we see, and the human elements therefore that are involved just play along and have to subscribe to that. Sorry if that was a little convoluted, but yeah, I was very curious. Thank you.
Thank you. Should we take more questions, or should I formulate a sort of answer to this one? And also, sorry, there's construction activity in my yard. So if you can hear any noises, I'm sorry.
That's a shared struggle for all of us, so you don't have to worry about that. There's construction around here as well. I think we should take other questions because...
And I can answer them in one go. Yeah.
Yes. Lalita, would you like to go ahead next?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kartik. That was an amazing presentation, and I really love the idea of fieldwork in the archive. Your talk also sufficiently triggered my memories of doing fieldwork in the archives in Benares many years ago, and I just want to extend sympathy for what you must have gone through in the Nagari Pracharani Sabha. And my question is about them. So I had the privilege of being in Mexico a few weeks ago, and I went to on a tour of some Mayan monuments, and they were talking about some of the Mayan manuscripts that were now in a library in Germany. And I asked if there was any movement to bring those manuscripts back to Mexico. And the Mexican guide went into a rant about how Mexicans don't take care of anything and how these manuscripts are much better off being in Dresden, Germany. And it was super uncomfortable. And I was like, it was really just a yes, no question. The guide not being Mayan, I feel that's relevant. So there is this colonial narrative, right? That these artifacts are not being taken care of in their original home. And so we see that in the NPS, and I'm wondering, we know why this is the case. I'm not trying to make a colonial argument at all. I'm really not at all, rather the opposite. But the lack of funding, the historical lack of funding, I feel the NPS might have used the Modi moment and Modi's political connection with Benares to try and get some money for these manuscripts or for its staff. So why is that not happening, I guess is my question, because it feels like if ever there was a time to preserve, this would be it, whatever we might think of the political motivation of that. That's my question. Thank you so much.
Are there any other questions from the audience? While questions are still developing, I'll maybe add one more, an archive of questions for you to maybe go back to as well. I think there's so much to ask here, but I think one thing that I would really want you to maybe go back to is the thing which you started, that there is a general resistance to acknowledging this work as fieldwork. And I was wondering if you could perhaps speak to why that might be. I think my hunch is that it is actually a refusal to acknowledge it as work worthy of being done by researchers from the global north. And I think an acknowledgement of the fact that this work, as you very well pointed out, requires a corporeal and affective discipline, which a lot of times, let's just be honest, a lot of researchers are not capable of doing, and that's why they end up relying on, underpaid research assistants. So if you could maybe give us, a few words of maybe your own experience of having to deal with this refusal to recognize this as something that everybody should go through, right? I think we have a lot, you have a lot to answer. Maybe you should go ahead and answer those. And meanwhile, if there are any questions in the chat box.
Do you want to pose any other questions, Paras, or I can answer them all?
Maybe one more. One is perhaps somewhat related to what Lalita was saying about the current moment, but perhaps looking at it from the perspective of the pandemic and how there has been this move towards digitization, and this impulse to digitize is all the more strong, and that goes against your insistence on tactility as not only a material but also a spiritual moment that you might have. So how might your conception of archive as fieldwork help us to resist this impulse to digitize? And maybe talk about this excessive materiality that you can only encounter in person.
Great. Okay, that is a lot to answer. I'll go one by one. Sorry. Am I still sharing my screen, or is it? Okay. I'm not, right?
No, not yet.
Okay. So thanks for those great questions. This is a lot to think about, even if I'm not sort of able to get to the end of all of your questions. I think I want to begin at the very end, which is this moment, like questions about this juncture of this point in time. So with COVID, but this discourse was sort of present even before that as well. There is a thrust towards the virtual, towards the digital, towards making the archive come alive in your laptop or your computer screen or whatever. But my archives are, as I said, off the center and very thin on funds, on resources, especially as we saw with the NPS. So this thrust has by and large not made its way there yet. But even if it does, we have to think about what it would mean. Having a manuscript as a PDF keeps us from touching and feeling, as I said, the bare material being of the text, which is very important. And as I showed, that there's really little that you can grasp of the Guttaka's round surface if you can't feel your way through the text. Then there is also the fact that a lot of folios are in really very bad condition, and putting them through a scanner, which may be very fancy, does damage to the paper. So they will do it if you pay, but should you? Which is not to say that I am not complicit in it. I live very far away from my site, so I pay for those texts which can be put under that scanner. So I'm including myself in that question. Lastly, even if the manuscript becomes a PDF, what of the people and of the livelihoods at stake? Because if people stop going to the archives, what will happen to the people manning the archive in places like the NPS? Then there was your question, Paras, about the resistance to acknowledging archival work as a kind of fieldwork, and of the sort of devaluation that fieldwork gets in many circles. And I think you're absolutely right in mentioning that it takes a certain affective investment work that most in the global north are not willing to put in, because when you enter the archive in a certain way, when you enter archives like the NPS and the Samarth Vagdev Devta Mandir, you have to get your hands dirty. And this is which is why I think most researchers in the global north tend to prefer the BL or the National Archives and so on. Essentially archives which are as impersonal as possible, archives where you can get away from even interacting with a person. Then there's that. Then there was Lalita's question about whether the NPS can make use of the Modi moment to get funds. I am not sure if they've made efforts to do it, but I'm sure they must have. But what I can tell, having lived in Modi's India for a long time, is that their emphasis on culture, their emphasis on pre-modernity, as it were, is pure rhetoric. It has by and large meant very little investment in really fostering research on these texts, on these sources, on these histories. And as we very well know, this is a government that actively runs away from history. Then at the end, there's Shubhangini's question, which is very hard to answer. And really, I'm still formulating the answer to that. But I will begin by saying that most of these catalogs, especially in places like the NPS, although I don't think the National Archives are really much better, these catalogs were made years and years and years back, and they've often not kept pace with the material that has been added, and also the material that just cannot be used anymore, which has been destroyed for various reasons by moths, by insects, and so on. But as to how I would place the fieldwork aspect, like the question of who is the agent, I think is a very hard question to answer. I, for instance, don't think I am the agent. And as I said, reading Farge, I do think that the solitude of the researcher is overstated. And there is a certain way in which I want to be responsible to the archive that I am working in. So one way of being more responsible to the condition of the material there, for instance, is copying by hand that which should be scanned. And Farge in her book has this bit where she says that people wonder what historians are doing in the archive, and actually we are mostly just copying out folios. So I'd say one way in which I want to be more responsible, less of an agent and more responsible, is by using less invasive technology. Then there is also the question of what is the future of places like the NPS? And it's clear that what they really need are more funds, and they get them by and large from universities like ours, from people who come in from universities like ours. So what I tell everyone going to work there is open your wallets with an open heart. But of course, throwing money at the problem will not solve issues of neglect. And I think historians and people working in these archives have to sort of have to themselves get involved in the upkeep of these archives. So to that end, for instance, and again, this is anecdotal, I have myself been trying to learn about preserving these texts, hoping someday to lend and even become an extra hand in the archive. So I am very keen to see what the future of these places would be. And if there is to be a future that is better than the present, then I think the researcher has to become less of an agent. That's my answer for now, but it's still something I'm thinking about. Thank you for those questions.
Thank you, Kartik.
And like, if there are any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and you can always reach out to them. Yeah. Their email ID.
Feel free to. I'd love to hear any feedback and so on, or any questions that you may have. I'm putting my email in the comments.
Thank you. And then I think Shubhangni can go ahead and conclude the session.
Thank you, Paris, and thank you, Kartik, also for answering my question. Yeah, just maybe like a quick 10 seconds on that. Like, I absolutely concur and empathize with your comment upon the moral complicitness that we have in the scanning, copying, and the respecting the materiality, the historic materiality of in some ways the artifacts that we're using to construct our research. But at the same time, I feel that despite all the ethics and the morals and the intentions that one does bring to the table, the infrastructure of many Indian archives especially do not enable, or rather even allow the researcher to be able to act upon their moral volitions. The fact that so many, you may want to look at the original document, but in many ways, if the archive is scanned, you may not even get access to that. And therefore, the only way to do that is to abide by those specific rules, which also are not uniform across archives. And then at the second, a lot, apart from the morality of it as well, the charm of working in a historic archive is also holding that or seeing that paper, the 100-year-old, 200-year-old typewritten or handwritten sheet. But really the constraints of time, which are even beyond the archive of the university, the research, and the compulsions of the task at hand, where everyone walks in the archive with an idea and trying to achieve that idea, but the method, the structure, the arrangement and the categorization of that archive really does not allow you to fulfill that idea in the ways that you thought, especially if it's your first time. So in that sense, like that, the agency bit and who is what are the agentic parameters of at least of a new archive or an archive that is being approached by a researcher for the first time over a period of time. And then again, for instance, in the National Vista thing, how is it that in the National Archives context, how does the Central Vista also become like, an important factor of where national and central government aspirations coincide with the rearrangement of very important national archives, including the Indira Gandhi, IGNCA and the National Archives as well. So anyway, that was my 2 cents on that.
Yeah.
With that, I will do exactly what I was supposed to do 2 minutes ago, which is to thank you for your valuable time and the amazing research that you gave us an insight to. And to also thank everybody present here, first and foremost, my co-coordinator Paris, to be the bastion of support and be an absolutely amazing co-moderator, co-coordinator as always. It's always been a pleasure working with you, and I hope to continue to do that in the spring quarter as we unfold our new set of events. More about that, you can learn more about our events through the mailing list as well as our Instagram and SAWG page. All of the links I put in the chat. Thank you to our audience joining from different time zones and all over the world for giving us your time. And lastly, also a big thank you to the Stanford Center for South Asia for their unending support to this event. I would like to end with a land acknowledgement, something I should have done at the start of the session, but better late than never. We recognize that Stanford is an occupier of the ancestral and unceded land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. We are grateful to be guests on this land and commit to solidarity with Indigenous struggles. With that, thank you again, and hope to see you for our next set of spring sessions that we'll be announcing. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Flash.